Hello. I thought it would be good to share some of my story with you because it does help understand why I do what I do, why I work, and I've been working with suicide prevention for so long. So here it is. I'm Brazilian. I come from a city in the northeast of Brazil called Recife. That's Recife. It is by the coast, and yes, it's a gorgeous city. Our childhood, I have two sisters, and I used to have a brother who died at 26. We lived most of our childhood, we lived in a house in the suburbs of Recife. Actually, it was really a rough area of town, but we had a great childhood there. We lived in this house that was, now when I think of it, it was a house in the middle of a huge yard. If you look at it, there were so many trees in that yard, and it was actually one of my favorite places to be. We had fruit trees everywhere, guavas, we had coconut trees, we have huge mango trees. There was one in the center of the garden in front of the house. I also loved to spy on our neighbors when I climbed the trees, I have to admit. The whole house was surrounded by a very tall brick wall, and that's where I used to sit and look down and listen to people talking. Back in the days, that's where people stayed. They stayed in the streets, and they would just sit in front of our house or in front of their homes and talk, and I would just sit there and eat guavas and pay attention. So now I'm going to give you a huge jump. Oh no, not before talking about the swing that my dad, when we were very little, he installed a huge swing on the side of the house, and we stayed there for hours and hours. Our home was always open. My mom and dad, they always left the doors open for neighbors, for friends, for family members. So it was a very full house all the time. He built that swing so we could have our friends and cousins, which I had many. I think the last time I counted, I had like 50 cousins. So that's where we stayed. We stayed around the house, either climbing the trees or pretending to be camping, which we also love to do. So that was a little bit of our childhood. And I'm going to jump until I was 19 years old because that was a mark in my life. That's when I decided that I wanted to learn English and I wanted to go abroad. And I also wanted, I think, to search for my own identity. That's what teenagers do, right? I came here to the United States, stayed here for 3 years, and then went back to Brazil, to Recife. At the time, my mom and dad were still married. Most of us were already, I'm the middle child, so most of us were already out. 2 years later, I think it was, let me see, I went back to Brazil when I was 23. Yes, because 1 year later, I got married. 2 years after that, I got divorced. And at the time, I was also thinking about moving out of my town and, just stay away for a while again. And I did that. I actually moved to the capital of Brazil for a while and then came back to Recife. Now I'm going to jump a little bit more again because this is not about me. It's about my dad and what happened in his life and how I see it, how I see his suicide now. A little, maybe 5 years before he died. Let me see. Let me do the math here. He and my mom, they had a good marriage for very long, but there was always a problem there. My father drank a lot. He was an alcoholic, which to me was very hurtful when I was a child. Not that he was ever aggressive or anything like that, but I just felt, and maybe some of you who relate to this story will understand, I just felt that when he drank, I lost him. And that's very hurtful for a child. Someone that you love to just disappear into someone you don't know. And I certainly didn't like that part of him. But it did get worse over time. It's really hard to know where it started getting worse, but I think one of the major things that happened to us that made the situation worse for my dad, and it was really, really hell for him, was my brother when he was 26 years old. He died in an accident. He was paragliding and he fell, free fall, and died instantly. And to my dad, that was, I think, the beginning of years and years of suffering for all of us. But I think for Dad, it had a different meaning because you know how it is, the only child. He was the youngest, the only boy. And my dad always tried to have a boy, so that symbolically, it was different for him. So that was a few years before his death. After that, Dad and my mom were drifting apart for many years, actually. And I remember one day I was talking to him, and it was really difficult for us kids to even go to their homes to visit them because I remember that they wouldn't talk to each other anymore, and we would have to go there, let's say on Sunday. Me and my two sisters would come and visit, and we would have to talk to my mom, and then one of us would go talk to our dad because it was just never an integrated thing anymore. It didn't feel like family anymore. And I remember one day I called my dad and I said, Dad, we need to talk, so let's have lunch. And we did, and I asked him, why on earth are you still married? I don't get it. You guys don't even talk to each other. And at the time, he was actually seeing somebody else, and he had been seeing her for over a year. And I said, you're seeing someone else? My mom knows. I mean, everybody knows. What keeps you from just separating and leaving? And I remember he said, you guys, I just don't know. I'm afraid of what you are going to think or the impact it's going to have on you. I said, Dad, we're not kids anymore. And it certainly hurts us more to see what's going on now with you and Mom than with a separation. So if that's what you're worried about, please leave. And I can say this in the name of my two sisters because they feel the same. I knew they did because we talked about it all the time. That was one good thing about my family, and still is. We talk about things. I believe that, and I even mentioned, you're seeing someone else. Why don't you try it? Try a real relationship, an open one that everybody sees and you don't have to hide anymore. And the woman was younger, and he said, I don't know if she wants that, so I'll ask. And I could tell that he really didn't know if he would be happy if he did that. And I said, Dad, you're not happy now. That we know for sure. So try something else. This is obviously not working for you anymore, and it's hurting everybody. So he did. A few days later, he left, and he did start a new relationship with this other woman. They moved in together after a while. And at the time, he was in his early 60s. So he moved in with the woman, started having a new relationship. And at the time, he decided to open a new business too. The business didn't work, so that was another loss for him. He was having a lot of financial difficulties at the time. And the marriage, I think, the new relationship was working fine, but I think it just added more pressure because this woman had two very young kids and he felt responsible. My dad was a family man for sure, and he felt responsible for the kids. So I think it just added more pressure to him. So I think all these things together compounded his pain. And I could tell that he was not doing well. He would call me. Sometimes he would come to my house. We would sit for a long time and he wouldn't talk. And I remember one day, and I was trying to help him financially, just organize his finances a little bit. And it did help for a while, I believe. But he was really feeling that his situation was so difficult that he didn't see a way out. And that's something very common with people who think about suicide, is that they don't see a way out of their situation and their pain. And one day I talked to him and I said, Dad, I think you are depressed. I think you should see a doctor. And he did. He did see a doctor. He was diagnosed with depression back then, but he never really followed through with the treatment. I think that had an impact too. So he kept getting worse and worse. So one day I wasn't out of town. I was actually abroad on vacation in the U.S. And I received a call from my sister. It was a Sunday, and I was supposed to come back that week on Thursday, the following Thursday. And she was very worried about my dad. He had just paid her a visit, and she said, Paula, I think he's going to hurt himself. There is something very wrong, because at some point in the conversation during the day, he spent there because he just wouldn't leave. She had this feeling that he was trying to say goodbye to them, to her and her daughter. my niece Clara, who now is 19, but at the time she was 5 at the time. So she said that she could tell that he just wasn't there. He was off. He was phasing out. Sometimes she would see that his lips were trembling as if he were about to cry. So she could tell there was something wrong, but she didn't know what. One of the things, and this is actually a warning sign that suicidal people give away, is that he wouldn't talk about me in the future tense. She asked him if he was going. My dad always picked us up at the airport. It was his thing. We never understood why, but he loved to pick us up at the airport. So my sister asked him, Dad, are you going to pick Paula up? She's coming on Thursday. And he would go back to the past and reminisce about a trip that we had taken years before. And he just would not talk in the future tense. And that was very odd. But, now that I understand about suicide and warning signs and all of that, I know that that's one of the signs. When the person decides that they're going to die, there's no reason why they should mention the future, because in their minds and in their hearts, they see that they know that there is no future for them. So he would just go, yeah, I remember a trip that I took with Paula, and we had so much fun. So my sister was really, really worried, and she called me and she said, I think he's thinking about hurting himself or something. And I said, don't worry about it. I'm coming back. And as soon as I get there, I will talk to him. But I didn't have time. So next day, I woke up very early on, again with my same sister, Renata. She was crying a lot, and she said, well, he's dead. He killed himself. And of course, I was in shock for a while. I just kept, to be honest, and this is a sign of trauma too. I have very little memory of what happened after that. My memory is very fuzzy. And it's just all blurred from that point on. For months, I actually have very little memory of what happened. I just remember that I had to rush back to Brazil, and I didn't get there in time for the funeral, because in Brazil we don't wait for funerals for very long. It's usually 24 hours later, not even 2 days most of the time. So when I got there, he had already been buried. But this is something else too that it just strikes me very weird. For many years, I thought I had been there in his funeral. How crazy is that? I had to actually ask a few people, was I there for the funeral? Because I couldn't remember. It was one of my memory losses after the shock of my dad's death. So anyway, the impact after that, what I did was I needed to understand. This is my way of dealing with pain. I need to understand what happened. And when it comes to suicide, I think this question mark was even bigger, because nobody talks about suicide. There wasn't much in Brazil at the time. It was 2005. I couldn't find books on the subject, so I bought books abroad. Fortunately, I can read English. So I started reading like crazy. I wanted to understand. I wanted to get in touch with his pain in a way, to see how big his pain was. And it did help me a lot, reading these books and talking to specialists. And as a journalist at the time, I decided that I was going to fill that void in Brazil and write a book about suicide with focus on prevention. And that's what I did. So I interviewed a lot of specialists from the US, from the UK, and authors of the books that I had read about suicide. And I also wanted to understand him better. So I talked to family members, to his best friends, people who were intimate with my dad. And I tried to understand what had happened to him, and something that at the time was really, really hard to grasp. One of the things that I understood about him was, and this was a shock to me at the time. I still remember the days. One of the few interviews that I remember very clearly was I interviewed my uncle, who is married to his sister, and my dad was actually the person who introduced them. because my uncle, before being my uncle, was one of his best friends. They had been in the military together, so he really knew my dad. And I remember I was talking to him, I was interviewing him, and I said, "Uncle, can you tell me a little bit about my grandfather? Because I really don't know much about him. I never met him, and when he died, my dad was so young. From what I know, he was 12 years old, and that's all I know about my grandpa. I never heard anything about him." And he looked at me puzzled, and he said, "Who on earth told you that?" And I actually didn't understand the question. I said, "What do you mean? When your grandfather died, you were born, Paula. Who told you he died when your dad was 12 years old? He was in his 30s. He was married to your mom. He had you and Renata already." And I was so shocked. I looked at him, and I actually thought at the time that I had made it up, that story. And I said, "No, this can't be true." So did I meet him? And he said, "No, I don't think you met him, but you had been born. You were very, very young, still a baby." So I called my sister and I asked her, "Renata, what do you know about our grandfather? Because I'm really confused right now." And she told me the same story I had told my uncle. And I called my other sister and she told me the same story. And I said, "Okay, I did not make it up. This is not something that I invented in my mind and a fantasy or whatever." And that information was so crucial to me because I understood one of the sources of my dad's pain, and one that he had never shared with us. Not only had he never shared this information, but he also had hidden it from us in such a drastic way by killing his father so he wouldn't need to talk about him. Of course, I needed to understand why that was, and I asked my uncle, and he told me the story. In fact, I knew my grandfather had gambling problems and had lost a lot of his money, actually all of it, to gambling. So I knew that there was addiction in the family back then, but I didn't know, how bad it was. So my uncle told me the story was that my grandfather was also an alcoholic, like my dad, and he died of it. That was what caused his death. So this had been so traumatizing to my dad, but not only that, I think the most important thing that I understood was that he saw himself in his father, his own father, and he did not like what he was looking at. He could not face that reality, and he was so ashamed of being an alcoholic that he had to hide it from us. I think he just hid it from himself. He couldn't face it. So that was one of the key things that I found out during my search for answers. I published a book, and then after that, I decided to create a website in my country, and I did that a few years after the book. And today I changed it. Actually, my dad's death completely changed my life. And at the time I was a journalist, but after the book I decided to become a psychotherapist. So I went to school and I was trained in psychoanalysis. Now I am finishing my master's in counseling in the US. Yeah, I just felt that it was, I don't know if I would say that was my calling, but it was a transformation that I went through due to my dad's suicide. I decided that I wanted to help people understand it because I knew the value of understanding. I wanted to help people break the silence because there's such a huge stigma associated with suicide, and I wanted to break that stigma. I wanted people to hear my story, to relate to it, to see how real and present suicide is. So that's what I've been doing since then. I recently created a website in English, understandsuicide.com. And this is what I work with. Now I am a therapist and I work with people, all kinds of patients, but my main desire is to help break the stigma that surrounds suicide. I want to help people who suffer in pain and in silence because of the stigma, because they don't feel they can talk to anyone about a loss about losing someone to suicide, or they are so vulnerable and they're thinking about suicide and they also don't find a way or a channel, or they don't find that they'll have the support they need from others. So this is what I do today, and this is why I also created the podcast. It's just part of my new journey, and that's my intention. I want to break the stigma. I want to break the silence, because I deeply believe that talking about suicide helps a lot. And in silence, suicide grows like any other pain.